Hey, I'm Ree, and in this video I'll go through how to do a mountain bike pre-ride check. So, first things first, why do we do these pre-ride checks? Well, the number one reason is to make sure that our bike is in a condition that's safe so that we're on the trail doing some gnarly stuff. Everything stays in place where it's supposed to be so that we don't crash or flip over the handlebars or injure ourselves or others. So the number one reason we do pre-checks, safety. The second reason is just so that we can have fun on the trail and not be worrying about the on-trail fixes that we might have to do if that could have been avoided in a pre-ride check. Alright, so the next thing that I'm going to go over, which is actually outside of the pre-ride check but also equally important on your ride, is the tools that you need to take with you on your ride. So it's really great if you have a multi-tool or some Allen keys. That's really imperative to bring. Otherwise, I always pack some lube just in case. The next thing that I always bring is a spare tube. So basically that's if I do end up popping a tire, because I do in fact have tubes in my tire. I have the right size, but I always make sure that I have this in my pack as well. And I always make sure that my shoes are on tight and they're looking sweet, as well as the bottom. You want to have some grip to be able to hook into these pedal spikes, and you don't want something that's loose or not so firm, because that can really impact your ride as well. The next thing is I always bring a rain jacket, because in the Rocky Mountains here you never know when the weather is going to shift. And of course, as you can see, I have bear spray actually in my water bottle holder, and I have the case of it clipped to my water bottle holder so that it's not going to fall out, but I can undo that Velcro and get my bear spray out in a jiffy if I ever needed to. Another couple important things to always bring on your rides is some extra water and some extra food. And the next most maybe important piece is actually your helmet, and I have a little helper here. And so you want to make sure your helmet fits properly on your head. So yeah, arguably the most important thing on our ride is actually our helmet. We're going to make sure that this fits us properly, and so in order to do that, we are going to put it on our head and just see how the overall fit feels. It shouldn't be too wobbly, it shouldn't move forward and backwards too much. Mine needs to be tightened a little bit in the back here. And a really sure, safe way of checking whether your helmet fits or not is to put your head upside down and give a good little shake. And if it falls off, it's maybe a little bit too loose. And if it stays on, you're in the clear. And then for the strap, you're gonna make sure that it's not super tight that it's choking you, but it's really tight. Maybe you can only get one finger in there, and it's gonna be really sturdy and secure on your head. So the first thing that we're gonna look at on this pre-ride check is actually the wheels here. So typically you drive to where you go riding on the trails and such. You don't necessarily always bike. So in some cases you have to detach the front, which in this case I've already done to show how we put it back on correctly and in a way that we're not ruining our bikes or our brake discs. So here we have our tire, and we've got this lever that will help us to put this back on. And then we've got our axle on this bike, and then a little knob here to help us tighten or loosen our tire. So when you're reattaching your tire to the front, and if you have a bike like myself, so I have a brake disc right here, and that's important because that'll tell me that the brake disc will slide into my bike here. See how I've slid the brake disc into where there's the slot here on my brakes? That's super important. You can't actually put the bike in the opposite way. So the next thing that we're gonna do is just tighten it here. And the main thing with this is you don't want it too loose like this. Awesome. Now that we've got the front tire reattached, it's not too loose, it's not too tight, we're gonna wanna do some other checks on it. So for example, the reason I have my bike upside down is so that I can get a good spin on it to see if the tire is true. Now to see if a tire is true or not, we're just going to spin it and if we see any big wobbles that look side to side or up and down, we're gonna see that something is not right with our bike and we're gonna need to fix up. And then we're just gonna do the same quick check on the back tire, make sure nothing is going wrong with that, nothing seems wonky or wobbly. Looks good to me. All right, the next thing that we're gonna check on our wheels is actually the spokes. So that's these guys right here, the long black metal type things in the middle of the wheel. And how we do that, we grab 2 spokes at a time from the same side and just pinch them together. And a good tip for this is to start at your valve stem so that you know where you've started and where to end. Basically what we're looking for here is if anything seems loose or off or bent or broken, it's really important to check that before the ride so that we can make sure that we're fixing things accordingly and not having issues on the trail. And the next thing that we're going to look at is our actual valve stem. We're going to make sure that that's just secure in place. It's not necessarily leaking. There's no gump or goo in it. It's still attached and upright. It's not broken or bent or anything. We're checking everything on both tires and not missing steps. We want lots of symmetry in our bike checks, especially when we're looking at the wheels. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is tire pressure. And there's a good analogy for this. You don't want your bike tire pressure to be too hard or too soft, because that just causes more problems on the trail. So basically a good analogy for this is if your bike tire feels like a hard, crisp apple, it's no good. You're not going to want that because it could pop. If your bike tire feels like it's a mushy banana, for example, that's also no good because that could cause damage to the rim or the tube or anything to do with the tire. So a happy medium between those two fruits is actually if your bike feels like an orange. So it should have some give, but not too much. Shouldn't be too squishy, but it also shouldn't be too hard. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do for our pre-ride check is our control systems up here. So I didn't mention this earlier because we were doing our front and back tire, but typically with a pre-ride check, you're going to want to be doing things from the front to the back to make sure that you're not missing anything. Again, the exception being those tires, so that when you're doing your check on one, you're doing the same check on the other, and you're not forgetting things by the time you get to the end of the bike. And the next thing that we're going to be doing in our pre-ride check is checking the brakes, because without brakes, you can't really go for a bike ride. Hey Willow, isn't that true? And to do this, we just squeeze the levers here on our bike. So for example, do a side profile here. I'm going to squeeze the front brake and try and push it forward. And we want to have that full stop, right? And it's the same setup with our back brake. So I'm pushing on the lever and I'm pushing back and I'm not really getting anywhere. So that tells me that my brakes are working just fine. So the next thing that we're gonna go through in our pre-ride check is cleaning and potentially lubing our chain here. So this is important because this is actually how we pedal and shift our gears, and if our chain falls off or breaks, that could be a potential issue on the trail that you come across that might put a damper in your ride. So it's important to make sure, just do a visual check that everything is lining up properly and making sure that there's nothing like super big or obvious in the actual chain itself. And then the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna lube it up. And so I have wet lube here. So how we go about lubing our chain, slowly put a little bit of lube on each chain. It really doesn't take a lot. You just need a little bit, and you're just gonna go one full rotation of your chain. And from here, the next important thing is to just wipe off the excess lube. The last thing that you want to do on your pre-ride mountain bike check is to pick your bike up and drop it. And if you hear anything super weird or anything falls off, that's a really good indication of that something needs to be fixed. All right, and that's our pre-ride mountain biking check. And if you follow these steps, You should have a fun and fantastic ride.